Hello. Our story begins inside the office as a Supreme Chancellor. Members from the Loyalist Committee, the party of the government that opposed the creation of the Clone Army, were babbling on about the war. Palpatine listened with caution, optimism, and provided a warm and comforting voice to them. The Loyalist Committee was still very strong inside the Senate, thanks to the likes of Senators Amidala and Organa, though even an inexperienced politician could see the writing on the wall. There were cracks inside the foundation of the party. The problem for the Loyalist Committee wasn't their policies. The senators that spoke to the Chancellor in this moment weren't turning on their morals. The challenge was the fact that the Separatists, after 8 months of galactic conflict, were winning. Not even the most die-hard members of the Loyalist Committee wanted to be swallowed up by the opposition faction. It wasn't good for business, and it certainly wouldn't have any benefits for them. They'd be a failed state of government, beaten by the weaker foe. They wanted to secure the Republic, and that's why they were pleading to the Chancellor right now. Palpatine was regretful about not being able to do anything about it, apparently. If they had supported him before the situation got out of control, then perhaps this war could have been averted. Obviously, Palpatine was just being petty. Regardless of what these politicians did, the war was gonna happen anyways. It was always a matter of when. Though the Supreme Chancellor let these representatives walk themselves around in circles. He could see the fright in their eyes and the concern in their voices. Not only were they personally afraid of losing the war, but there was serious pushback from their home worlds. No one wanted to deal with battle droids destroying their homes, nor clone troopers landing on the surface of their planets. This war needed to be won by the Republic without a military occupation over the galaxy. Palpatine continued playing the innocent card because he couldn't do anything but request for more clones. That was the first part of his plan. He just needed the doubtful to feel hopeless. He let them sit with it in their conversation as it dragged out. This meeting was by no means short. It never was meant to be, regardless of what these politicians came here with the intention of saying. Palpatine knew that. The Loyalist Committee liked to talk the talk. Most of it was bumbling lunacy, but it made for entertainment in the Chancellor's eyes. He knew that if the Republic started off weak, with crushing defeats towards some of the largest clone forces in the Grand Army, he could sway the opinion of his political rivals. This, though, was a surprise. These were some members, maybe not as important as Organa and Amidala, but definitely carried a bigger voice inside their party. He filled their minds and hearts with worry, but provided them tiny speeches of hope, before he suggested something that could upset the status quo. Perhaps instead of using their credits on more clones, which was proven to get them inefficient results, they could build a larger weapon. The representatives in front of Palpatine pondered about what he could mean. What larger weapon was there, built in the last 1,000 years, that would have any positive effect on the war for the Republic? Starlight Beacon was a gorgeous superstructure for community, but not for action. Before that, they had weapons during the Old Republic, but nothing more. And not to mention, all the vessels from the ancient days were out of date by this point. It wasn't like the Republic was throwing old hammerhead corvettes into battle against the Seppies, so what weapon could he potentially be referencing? The Sith Lord behind the desk knew he couldn't just come out with a superweapon, whose blueprints were built on Geonosis. A Death Star wasn't going to make the Loyalist senators join him with resounding excitement. He needed them to come up with the actual concept. He couldn't do it himself. It already existed, obviously, but they needed to be the monsters behind its creation. Remember, Palpatine was just the Chancellor. Nothing went through the Senate without the overwhelming support of the representative body inside the Rotunda. Palpatine didn't reference any specific weapon from the ancient days. The answer to the question posed by the senators was that he had no idea for a weapon. The Supreme Chancellor couldn't just willingly tell the senators of the opposition party that he'd been dwelling on the concept of a Death Star since before the war. He played innocent, throwing out words that made sense but didn't have any real impact behind them. It wasn't until Palpatine suggested that the Republic look into creating a super weapon capable of being what the Malevolence should have been for the Separatists. They needed an X factor, a weapon to protect themselves from the droid onslaught, something that not even the Confederacy could conceptualize. He then reminded the representatives that the Separatists were blowing resources on weapons all the time. Perhaps they could use something that was a one and done, a super weapon capable of being such a threat that the Separatists didn't even want to continue participating in the war out of fear. Palpatine suggested a concept for a weapon that could end the conflict without needing to fire a single shot, the ultimate lifeline to protecting their way of life. This didn't insinuate planet-destroying weapon, nor a super laser, or anything worse than that. Sure, the malevolence was a reference, but even these senators knew that the super ship couldn't destroy planets. It forced every single individual to leave his office with ranging thoughts of what kind of weapon might end this war. Sidious, truthfully, in all of his brilliance, never really considered bringing the Death Star to the Republic, because it truly needed to be an Imperial constructed weapon. There were resources that he knew the station would need during its development that the Republic couldn't reasonably attain. It was a weapon built for the Imperial era, but since the Republic senators showed so much interest in constructing something to scare the Confederacy into surrendering, he figured he might as well look for resolutions to creating the weapon. Palpatine had all the specs together thanks to the Geonosians. The early models of the Death Star were for a much smaller iteration of the superstructure. It of course would have the ability to destroy a planet, but the station was closer in size to a dwarf planet, or smaller than the average moon in the galaxy. Still powered by kyber crystals and still in need of a massive crew to operate it, but Palpatine put together a plan to make it work. He had solid connections across the galaxy both as Chancellor and also as Darth Sidious. What mattered to him most right now was the force that could construct this if the senators had a plan for it. He didn't have the Republic manpower to just occupy all of Kuat and keep the war convincing at the same time. Kuat produced all of their Venators. He couldn't just make them build a superstation and not build Venators. He, as a Sith Lord, planned to use slave labor for the first part of the structure's construction, because it wouldn't require a lot of paid labor. So, before anyone even actually agreed to build something of this magnitude or power, he sent out bounty hunters to all the criminal syndicates in the galaxy to get price estimates. See, without a fully mobilized empire willing to do the bidding of their leader, he needed to pull pieces and parts for such a large weapon from other sources outside the government. For example, slaves on Zygeria might be more productive for creating the armoring plates that would surround the station, or slaves within Hutt territory would be more efficient with the construction of lighting in hallways. With the Republic budget he had at his power, he couldn't pay off this weapon. It just wasn't doable. He also didn't have control over the banks yet either, so it wasn't just like he could wipe away interest rates or use the Galactic Reserve to pay off this project. These two were also plans for the Clone War, so that he could have the ability to create weapons like the Death Star when the Empire actually rose. There also remained the question of the engineers capable of designing modified blueprints to make sure the weapon finished properly. It was such a large machine that couldn't just be put together like any regular old Venator. Palpatine went through thousands of documents of contacts and of material he might need to construct this project. This was all pre-planning. There were pieces that would actually be pretty easy to cover for him, others not so much, but at the end of everything, the Sith Lord understood that this weapon would need a certain level of deception to complete reasonably within the Republic. The methods of construction had to be concealed from the Senate if the senators went through with it, but first they needed to agree to it. Surprisingly, even the Palpatine, who did all the extra planning on the off chance they decided to, the members of the Loyalist Committee returned to him with ideas and suggestions for a weapon. They were dead serious about pulling out a full-blown mega weapon to scare the Separatists back into silence. It really made him laugh on the inside. Despite the Loyalists being pro-democracy, against the war, and even considered to be righteous in their pursuits of ending it, they were the ones pushing the most aggressive resolve. Yet it should be noted, the Loyalists weren't trying to use the weapon. They were genuinely just trying to use scare tactics by coming up with the most expensive scare they could think of. Palpatine again sat in his office as ideas rambled on and passed him by. Most were no good, obviously. For example, they came up with a bigger Venator, their own droid army, and even some other ship designs like the Malevolence. Sidious was quite disappointed that they took his Malevolent's example too literally. He shouldn't have had high expectations, and in many ways he didn't, but he was still, in his mind, permitted to be disappointed. Everyone had similar ideas, so Palpatine, without laying into something he clearly came up with, combined suggestions, called one senator's ideas brilliant. Maybe paired with someone else's, it could be remarkable. He didn't tell them his immediate thoughts, he simply gave them a path to follow towards his curation. Palpatine was brilliant with manipulation, and this was no different. Every proposition was followed by another, with Palpatine's input, and hours more of discussion. They then eventually came around to the idea of the Death Star. They didn't call it that, they called it a maneuverable space station with enough weaponry to destroy a fleet. Maybe it wasn't a quote-unquote planet killer, but it was close enough for Palpatine to work with. He told them all that he quite liked the idea of a moving space station. It could operate like a singular fleet, have less weaknesses than the Malevolence, and also be moved from system to system as a base of operations or a forward command post. To Palpatine, this was a brilliant idea, but he told these Loyalist senators that if they wanted this type of weapon to end the war, then he needed them. He explained that the Senate, especially members of the Loyalist Committee, would call him an extremist if he presented this idea. His mission statement had forever been, throughout the war, the same: keep the peace or bring peace back to the galaxy. So, if they wanted this superstation, then the proposition had to come from the Loyalist Committee itself. There were no other ways around that. These senators actually agreed with this statement with little hesitation. They knew what they were proposing, but Palpatine reassured any doubts that they might have, that he could pretty much guarantee support from across the aisle if they proposed it. 2 weeks after the second conversation with Palpatine, a third of the Loyalist Committee would bring forth a proposition inside a Senate session. They were all in decent communication with the Chancellor, so he knew what to expect from them. But the Loyalist senators took the stand and explained their plan for the Republic weapon to protect their systems. Something that, if successful, could be multiplied and used across the galaxy. They had to defend their way of life, literally using Palpatine's words, and in the absence of the Separatist Malevolent supership, they could seize advantage of the power gap. Everyone and their mother knew that the Separatists outmanned the clones 100 to 1, so why not they, as a government, provide their troopers and their citizens with a chance to win? And, this coming from another one of the delegates, they could potentially scare the CIS away from continuing the war. If they saw the industrial power of the Republic in full swing, then perhaps this conflict could be over without firing another shot. There were members of the Loyalist Committee that felt backstabbed, others that saw the profit and stability in a move like this. From the other aisle in the Senate, people that typically aligned with the Chancellor, they were more than eager to jump onto a massive project like this. It was an industrial masterpiece, something that they could funnel credits into their bank accounts with. That was the beauty of war, for many of the Republic senators. The more money that was supposed to go to the clones for their payroll or something else relating to the Kaminoan Red Army actually ended up in the pockets of the senators. They were all greedy, and they all found their own means to making as many credits off the war as they could. This project would help them do that more. Regardless of their methods, this superstation provided them all with a chance to make more money, and then of course win the war. The greedy system voted overwhelmingly in favor of the creation of a superweapon. Senators like Organa and Amidala tried to rally a stance against it, believing that a simple peace treaty could make a bigger difference. They were mocked though. The Senate was finally almost in total agreement for the first time since before the invasion of Naboo, and these few loud voices wanted to act like they could determine the fate of the galaxy while everyone else was ready to move on. Padme and Bail, they couldn't. Palpatine made sure of that by undercutting them with members of their own party. But the creation of the bill to start building the Death Star would also be the total end and collapse of the Loyalist Committee. Everything Senator Amidala worked on since joining the Republic fell apart in one swoop. Organa and their other close allies would discuss the implications of this. Some even considered secession themselves, seeing the Republic as a larger warmonger than the Confederacy. Others believed that a personal discussion with Palpatine might make a difference, but the leaders, Padme, Bail, and Mon, knew that regardless of what they did, they couldn't reverse this bill. Despite the Death Star having a flashy new name like Republic 1, its specifications would be no different. The first blueprints would be presented by the Loyalist senators that started this entire ordeal. It was an angular space station with a large ball in the middle. It was a combination of the Starforge and Starlight Beacon. It looked more like the former while being closer to the size of the latter. Palpatine didn't care about the overall look of the station because he just needed an approval for the materials needed to construct the weapon. It took about a week for the first Republic 1 blueprints to make it to his desk after the vote. He asked for modifications to be made to the structure and the design, so that it could be done in a more sleek way, like the plans he got from Geonosis, again without directly saying that. The importance around this first set of blueprints entirely revolved around publishing the documents needed to confirm the materials that were being obtained inside the Republic. These documents went straight to the Security Council and some other wartime committees. This is how Palpatine maintained loyalty inside of a Republic that wasn't an empire. To that end though, the Supreme Chancellor had a bunch of materials that came from locations not related to systems on the Manifest. Thanks to slaves across the Outer Rim and battle zones across the galaxy, important construction materials landed on Corellia, so that this superstation could begin actual work on the surface. It also should be said that the Clone Wars provided the perfect cover for obtaining materials not through slave labor. The Chancellor could hide the extraction of materials from a besieged world because of conflict. Sometimes following the creation of this bill, Dooku would be ordered to send troops to a random unaffiliated planet for what seemed to be no reason, and while it never bothered Tyrannus because they were battle droids, it provided the Republic with an opportunity to covertly take ores without anyone's knowledge or permission. For Palpatine, it was important to keep this hidden, not just from the government he served, but his apprentice too. And the best part is, the clones who were doing most of the heavy lifting had no problem doing it and not telling. It was beyond their pay grade to care about who knew and who didn't. If orders came from the Chancellor to take ore or strip a planet of its resources, they would do it. There were two parts to Corellia's operation: the gathering of materials inside Corellian shipyards on the surface, and then of course the skeleton of the space station built outside the planet. Palpatine moved metals, stones, ores, crystals, and so forth through the Outer Rim and into the core. Anything this space station could use, he'd try and provide through external contacts. From inside the Republic, specifically the government, these looked like long-time government relationships and contacts. Shipments from Kessel were batched together with fuel, but it wasn't just fuel. Sometimes it would be armor plating, other things created by the slaves for the entire structure. It was a huge network, and despite the syndicates making their money, no one, not even Dooku, knew about this weapon outside of the government. The session that confirmed the creation of the Death Star was not public. No one needed to know, because it was meant to surprise the galaxy. So all of these people around the Outer Rim were doing contract work for Sidious or Palpatine without knowing where their work was going. Not that it mattered anyways, a job was a job. It was the most immoral creation inside the Republic, and no one knew. Slave labor was cheap for the Sith Lord to pay for, cheap to transfer, and easy to cover up, because Sidious handled all the negotiations with bounty hunters or as the Dark Lord of the Sith. And the reason he was paying slaves is because he wasn't paying them, he was paying the syndicates that owned them for their labor. No one had anything on the Supreme Chancellor, and for months, he and his colleagues inside the Galactic Senate would watch the Corellian shipyards construct a dwarf planet-sized superstructure outside of its orbit. The skeleton of the space station wasn't what Palpatine wanted. It was much smaller in all actuality, but thanks to engineers who were fresh out of the academies like Galen Erso, they were able to refine the design. There was an underlying difference about the structure the government voted for and the personnel that were working on a superweapon. Maybe it was a space station that was slowly transforming into a vessel that could detonate a fleet with a single blast, but at the end of the day, it was for the war, and no one really cared, not even the personnel working on it, because this was patriotism in their eyes. Instead of a coalition being introduced to a Death Star 20 years after the nearest galactic-scale war, this weapon was being created in the heat of conflict. The Republic was defending itself righteously from the oppression of the Confederacy and their battle droids. For someone like Galen Erso, they didn't see this weapon as problematic, because to him, it wasn't. This was a weapon, sure, but one to defend the Republic from an aggressor, so there were no hiccups, no delays, and no defects to make sure the weapon could be destroyed. This wasn't just felt by engineers like Erso, but the senators who voted on the project. This Republic One weapon was defense. It might be threatening or powerful enough to wipe out an entire fleet in a singular blast, but it was to protect their way of life. It would be operated by clones and people. It would have physical troopers with conscience behind the controls. This wasn't a ship controlled by droids or led by a cyborg like Grievous. It was surprisingly easy for everyone, including members of the former Loyalist committee, to jump behind the Supreme Chancellor on this weapon. And even though it remained out of sight and knowledge for the Jedi Order, this was almost the great unifier inside the Galactic Senate, perhaps the greatest thing that Chancellor Palpatine ever did. Unfortunately, no one knew how much blood was shed for this structure to reach completion. Keeping a weapon of this size a secret from the Jedi didn't end up lasting forever. They were too deeply a part of the Republic for Palpatine to totally exclude them. But by the time they learned of its development, it was too late for them to do anything about it. The voices of the Council might have disagreed with the creation of the superstructure, but they also couldn't do anything about it. When they first discovered it, the structure already had armor plating around it, and the only remaining piece was the superweapon dish. To many within the Senate, they didn't know that a laser cannon was being developed for the Death Star. They knew the space station could destroy a fleet, but they didn't care about the how. This was the answer to how they could. Palpatine kept the important militaristic detail inside the ranks of the military instead of the government. Erso, Krennic, Tarkin, and the clones were important to the construction, not the senators. The Jedi, though, they were considered outsiders, government officials, if you will. They played a more important political role than a militaristic one. This was really a BS kind of excuse because the Jedi were always on the front lines, fighting and dying on behalf of the Republic. But what were they gonna do about it? Stand out like sore thumbs like Mothma, Organa, and Amidala? No, of course not. The Council took it on the chin and realized that they no longer held influence inside the Republic. They did start coming up with their own counters to this though. Each of them knew that Republic One was more powerful than the Chancellor let on. He was preaching about the threat it could pose to the Confederacy, not what the actual station could do. The questions to members of the Senate and Palpatine himself were met with silence and/or threats. Palpatine kept the Jedi at a distance intentionally, because once they learned what the weapon could do, they would turn on him. And yes, for Palpatine, that was all a part of the plan. Before the superstation Republic One was released on the galaxy, Darth Sidious made an important audible for the Separatists. The plan for the Clone War had always been the first year and a half would be strongly in favor of the CIS. They'd win more battles, prompting the Republic to give more emergency power to the Chancellor, and then request for more clones. The second year and a half of the conflict would be focused specifically on rebuilding Republic morale and winning. They would technically win the war naturally, and so on and so forth. The audible that the Sith Lord made, that surprised Dooku, who still didn't know about the superstation, was giving the CIS more victories. Republic One finished at the end of the 2-year point of the war, a full 6 months after the tide was initially supposed to shift into favor of the Republic. The Senate was in shambles. They were so worried that they wasted their funds on a weapon that they'd have no victory with. Palpatine, though, remained calm, both for the Senate and in the public spotlight. With the Republic losing so much, thanks to this simple change of plans, Palpatine gave himself insurance. The government, their constituents, and the clones were all feeling the weight of defeat. Thanks to the secrecy of the weapon, Palpatine made sure he appeared with Republic One when it was first revealed to the galaxy. It was a trap, intentionally set for the Separatists, and one that would cost them one of their greatest warriors. Jedi General Anakin Skywalker was leading an assault in space when General Grievous's fleet arrived to reinforce the defending location. Anakin's forces were struggling, and Yularen was about to call for the retreat. But then, from deep space arrived a superstation, the size of a dwarf planet. Perhaps it wasn't as big as the Death Star could have been, but it was still an insanely large space station, one that dropped the jaws of everyone present at the battle. Skywalker didn't even know about Republic 1, because not even the High Council elaborated on their discovery to their peers inside the Order. From the command deck, Director Krennic, who actually held control over the station because Tarkin was still a Republic captain, ordered the fire of a single reactor ignition. Beside him stood his longtime friend Galen Erso, who was so beyond proud of the work he'd done on this beautiful station. A green beam lit up around the circular dish in the center of the structure, before combining in the middle and launching past the Republic fleet, consuming fighters in the way and demolishing General Grievous' flagship in one blow. It wasn't just a hit on the command vessel though. The explosion, thanks to the pure kyber crystals mined from Jeddah, thanks to a CIS occupation, sent a rippling detonation outwards. Entire starships, frigates, and cruisers were consumed in the blast. General Skywalker and Admiral Yularen were able to finish off the surviving fleet, which consisted of a few light frigates, which were defenseless. Palpatine from the bridge congratulated Krennic and Erso on their hard work, thanking them for saving the Republic war effort. He, like the grandpa-like politician he was, stepped away so the inventors could seize the spotlight. Palpatine looked more messianic than ever before. He was liberating the Republic from their streak of losses, and at the end of all of it, he was humble enough to let the inventors be the heroes of the day. This attack shocked everyone, most of all Count Dooku. He was genuinely in disbelief. How didn't any of their scouts pick up on this? How come Sidious never told him? Well, the first question is easy. Palpatine had control over the droid armies. The second one, even easier. Dooku was never meant to see the rise of the Empire. With life high for the Republic and genuine terror struck into the hearts of the Confederacy, as the Galactic Senate intended, the CIS Parliament rallied together for an emergency session immediately. Dooku knew he needed the support of his government to activate the reserve droid military, because to be honest, he believed that his master was going to try and kill him. Tyrannus was so trusting of Sidious up until this moment. If Grievous was expendable, then so was he. Dooku's panic was felt by every single representative of the Confederacy. This was the first time in their lifespan as a Confederacy that he wasn't in total control. Their session started within 24 hours of the strike against General Grievous. The Republic was filled with hope. The Chancellor, still inside the superstructure, was waiting inside of hyperspace. Reporters were covering the entire event for Republic media, as it was being labeled an event. This was the most exciting the war had been since Geonosis. At the beginning, the Republic thought victory was imminent. Weeks after Geonosis, the Confederacy thought the same. Now, though, both sides shared completely opposite opinions on the state of the war. Dooku's revelation about this droid reserve military was a shock to many, but the explanation was that the corporate alliances didn't want to release all their battle droids on the galaxy. The war was never meant to go on for this long, and they were kept in reserve to make sure the Confederacy never lost its independence. To the people who seceded from the Republic, which was everyone present, this was a totally understandable rationale. Dooku hiding this reserve military from them, also in their eyes, wasn't the greatest sin ever, mostly because there was a Death Star. However, despite this emergency session trending towards the activation of the reserve military, the Supreme Chancellor was being fed intel from an informant within the Confederacy. Yes, of course, Palpatine had someone tell him everything the CIS did. Sure, there was Dooku, but no one could be trusted forever. It was thanks to this informant that Republic 1 exited out of hyperspace over the Confederate capital world of Rexus Sagundus. The session continued with Dooku, gathering the votes he needed to activate the reserve military, when a roar of panic ensued outside the Parliament headquarters. Before Dooku, the senators, or even the informant could get outside the parliamentary building, Republic 1 sent a blast to the surface of the planet, destroying all of Rexus Sagundus in a single detonation. From the main command chambers, the media, Krennic, Erso, and Palpatine stood in silence. Republic 1, smaller in size, was no different than the Death Star, and it just brought death and destruction to a world with a couple billion residents. No one said a word. there weren't cheers from the people of the Republic, nor inside the command center of Republic 1. But despite this mass loss of life felt by every Jedi on Coruscant, there was one other thing. The silence may have come from shock, yet the feeling felt by most people inside the Republic was not grief, outrage, or terror. It was relief. The Chancellor just once again proved how willing he was to do the wrong thing for the right reasons on behalf of everyone. This effectively put an end to the war, and almost retroactively and immediately put a target on the heads of the Jedi, who rushed across the city of Coruscant to arrest every single senator of the Republic for crimes against the galaxy. Thanks to being on a transport without any Jedi, Palpatine didn't need to worry about the effects of Order 66. Instead, from a distance, as he watched the news reports cycle in from the Republic capital, he called the order. The execution of Order 66 was a quiet choice, one done inside the privacy of his own residence inside the space station. It actually accompanied an entirely different order for a much different unit. Palpatine, while he was heading towards Rexus, pulled a couple of units of clone commandos to Mustafar to make sure the droid armies could be shut down at the same time as the destruction of Rexus. He was always going to blow up Rexus. No one inside the command center really knew that, but they did it anyways because orders are orders. The clones again, regardless of where they were, whether it be on Mustafar or over Rexus, were just following orders. And the same could be said for the troopers that had to endure Order 66 across the Republic. On Coruscant specifically, the Jedi were out of their element. They were inside the Senate building, then attacked by Senate commandos and the Coruscant Guard. They were distracted by the darkness in the galaxy. The Jedi Temple then was attacked by the 212th and the 104th. Out in the middle of the wreckage field of Grievous's fleet, General Skywalker would weave in front of a shot meant for Ahsoka, and his ship would spin out of control, slamming into debris, detonating and killing him in the blast. Ahsoka too would be shot down by the experienced troopers and pilots of the 501st. Death was the fate meant for the Jedi, and of course for anyone who saw the reports of their hostile attack on Coruscant, they believed the Jedi deserved it. The worst part is, and the brilliance in all of this, was what it did to the galactic population. Palpatine accidentally, but also at the same time intentionally, desensitized the entire galaxy to total violence. Trillions of citizens watched Republic 1 destroy Rexus Sagundus, which in turn translated into trillions of people watching billions of people die so that war could be brought to an end. Just after, that same galactic population watched Jedi generals attack the Senate building, killing Senate commandos that resisted their occupation before being hunted down by the Coruscant Guard that protected the capital. It was both a tumultuous but quick end to the Clone War, and once again, at the end of all of it, Palpatine looked like a genius. The informant's message about the activation of the reserve military to crush the Republic from Rexus would become public information, tied directly to the destruction of Rexus Sagundus. Palpatine not only ended the war, but prevented a galactic-scale genocide that would have been created out of a separatist fear. And to add to that, because Sidious could shut down the droid armies with a squad of commandos who would never speak of their mission, it would look to the public that Palpatine's orders over Rexus single-handedly saved the war. Again, from their perspective, Palpatine killed Grievous, the Separatists overreacted by activating a reserve military that would destroy the galaxy, and then Palpatine put an end to it. He was a hero. On the other side, did Galen Erso regret his decisions to build Republic 1? He absolutely did after the events at Rexus. But even for him, it was too late. There were no weaknesses in the structure. Galen Erso created the Death Star in a rushed state to save the Republic. He didn't drag his feet on technological advancements, he didn't design any weaknesses. It was a foolproof design, one that could simply be copied and pasted onto any other superstructure the Republic wanted. And to add to the great pain of Galen's creation, most Republic officers didn't regret the destruction of Rexus. Only Erso had to live with the guilt of the pain he caused the galaxy. Because for most military officers and even Republic citizens, Republic 1 was an important reminder to the galaxy that terror would be met with total destruction. In the weeks following the Jedi Purge and the end of the Clone War, the Empire rose without any naysayers. Padme was distressed as she laid her husband to rest on Naboo, with the rest of her family. She wouldn't even be inside the Senate Rotunda when the Empire was born. Yes, this was absolutely intentional on Palpatine's part. The body of Skywalker wasn't really salvageable. There remained his metallic arm and some other pieces in the wreckage. Didn't really matter. Point being, Palpatine made an effort to make sure he earned Padme's trust by allowing her to bury her husband. And the truth is, from her perspective, she couldn't even blame the government. The Jedi attacked first. She was resentful of the Republic, eventually Empire, but never did she actually see Palpatine as the antagonist. His actions at Rexus were reckless, but they ended the war, and the emotional distress of Anakin's death left her vulnerable to Palpatine's manipulation. Because the Jedi were targeted and turned into an enemy of the state, it was hard for anyone to openly oppose the Empire as it became an empire. There were even calls from the Senate to construct more Republic battlecruisers. Obviously, Republic 1 kept its name because it was considered the liberator of war, but future battle stations would retain the name of Empire 2, 3, and so forth. The smaller size of the structure provided the Empire with the chance to make more, and station them around the galaxy for protection. But there were modifications made by Senator Amidala, who Palpatine brought into his corner after Anakin's death. She just demanded and pleaded that the Imperial battle stations could also be made into communal centers for struggling worlds. So in a funny way, everything did come full circle. The ideas first suggested by the Loyalist senators during the war ended up becoming crucial to the Imperial line of super space stations. Instead of more barracks for Imperial stormtroopers, there'd be entire districts designed for citizens, just like it would have been inside a Starlight Beacon. Eventually, this common space would be integral to the creation of a total galactic empire, one that covered every corner of the galaxy. But that wasn't just a sign of peace. It was a sign that Emperor Palpatine succeeded and the Sith won. Without the Confederacy, there were Jedi rebels. They were the only remnant of the old galaxy before the war. Since the Inquisitors were never created, the Emperor needed to kill these Jedi himself, but he was also able to return to a plot of his that started during the early months of the Clone War. Thanks to Cad Bane's holocron heist, Palpatine disclosed his plans to create a slave army of Force-sensitive spies. He wanted to put them in corners of the galaxy to make sure his enemies could never rise to challenge him. With complete control over the government, new Imperial space stations being developed off of Urso's finalized blueprints, and the Jedi in shambles, Palpatine created his slave army. Using holocrons from the old temple, he found and located every single child located by the Jedi Order. They'd be abducted and brought into his ranks to be trained into servitude, before being released on the galaxy as spies. They would, in all actuality, be the final asset to his empire. Thanks to starting the Imperial era with the first Death Star, he didn't need to build up a superstructure or a military to maintain order. People were desensitized because of Rexus, and they willingly supported another station if it meant no more wars and better protection. It was the singular gift that kept giving to Emperor Palpatine. Sure, Amidala would take up problems with the continuous cycle of autocratic patterns displayed by the Empire, but she wouldn't start the rebellion. Mon and Bail wouldn't either, because there wasn't enough support, openly, for them to build one. The Empire was stronger than it could have ever been if the Clone Wars had gone down its initial route. This was Palpatine's greatest audible, the greatest change he could have ever made. And even if it did cost him his prized apprentice, he made up for it with centuries of undisputed rule over the cosmos. And that, my friends, is a dark story. Special thanks to all the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash the like button. Let's talk about this story. Also, Sith Clone Wars on Saturday. You know what is. Go check it out. Season 4 is out now. Otherwise, wow, this is dark. This is really Palpatine in his most brilliant form. I think Palpatine in the story really kind of understands the galaxy he's working with. I think this story only works if the Loyalist senators are the ones that go to him and ask for his support to end the conflict. I think the beauty of this one is that Palpatine is able to do everything he does with the Empire, but he's able to do it because of the cover of war. He's able to take advantage of the pure chaos in the galaxy by creating a weapon that no one's going to see coming. I mean, it's really like the Death Star on steroids. There's not going to be any hiccups because, Galen Erso is going to be doing this for patriotic duties. He's going to be working day and night to save the Republic, to become a hero. And not until after it's finished does he realize what he created. He knows that the Death Star can destroy a planet, but he's not thinking about planets. He doesn't even think that's a target. So it's just a continuous cycle of people trying to do the right thing for the wrong reasons. And the worst part is the Loyalist senators that proposed it initially, they're just doing it to scare the Separatists. They don't actually think Palpatine's going to use it. And that is kind of the ugly and beautiful part about this story, is that it truly is just a story about the Republic and the reason it fell anyways. I mean, their complacency cost them everything. It cost them the galaxy. And in this, it's their hubris that ends up helping Palpatine build a sustainable empire. And I really wanted to highlight the desensitization part of it, because I think that's something that we experience in our own lives. But I think Palpatine having the entire galaxy watch Rexus be destroyed on screen live time, I think that would actually desensitize the galaxy. The biggest difference here and the biggest part pulling for him is that, one, he's not destroying Alderaan, but two, it's active war. The Confederacy is the looming threat. They've won almost the entire Clone War up until this point. So to the people, they see this as the only way to just end the war without losing it. And it works out for him in the end. So I hope you all enjoyed this twisted story. It's definitely one of Palpatine's best victories in any of my stories. But anyways, I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.